In 1916, thousands of young men marched forward with confidence. They laughed, they joked, they believed the war would soon be over. Many of them would not live to see the next sunrise. What awaited them was not glory, not victory, but the deadliest day in the history of the British Army. This is the story of the Battle of the Somme. To understand the Somme, you have to understand the war that created it. The First World War had begun in 1914, a conflict unlike anything the world had ever seen. What started as a political crisis between nations quickly escalated into a global war, pulling in empires, alliances, and millions of soldiers. At first, many believed it would be short, a matter of months, maybe even weeks. They were wrong. By the end of 1914, the war in Western Europe had reached a brutal stalemate. From the North Sea to the borders of Switzerland, a scar stretched across the land, a continuous line of trenches carved deep into the earth. On one side, the German Empire. On the other, the Allied forces, primarily France and the United Kingdom. Neither side could break through. This was trench warfare, a new, horrifying kind of war where progress was measured not in miles, but in meters. Soldiers lived in narrow, muddy ditches surrounded by barbed wire, rats, disease, and constant fear. Rain turned the ground into thick, suffocating mud. Bodies often remained where they fell, sometimes for days, sometimes forever. And between the trenches lay no man's land, a barren stretch of destroyed earth separating the two sides. Crossing it meant almost certain death. Machine guns, artillery, and rifles made any open advance nearly impossible. Every attempt to push forward was met with devastating fire. Thousands would charge, and thousands would fall. By 1915, it had become clear this war would not end quickly. Both sides searched desperately for a way to break the deadlock. New weapons were introduced. Massive artillery bombardments became common, but nothing seemed to change the outcome. The front lines barely moved. The war had turned into a battle of endurance, a test of which side could suffer longer. Then came 1916, and with it, a crisis. In February, German forces launched a massive offensive against the French. Their objective was not just to capture land, but to exhaust France completely. The fighting became relentless. Day after day, wave after wave of soldiers were sent into battle. Explosions never stopped. The ground shook constantly. France was under enormous pressure. They needed help, desperately. The responsibility now fell heavily on Britain. Until this moment, the British Army had been preparing, recruiting, training, building strength. Many of its soldiers were volunteers, young men who had answered the call with patriotism and hope. They had trained, they had waited. Now they would be called to act. A plan was formed. A massive joint offensive between British and French forces would take place along a river in northern France, the Somme. The objective was clear: relieve the pressure on the French and finally break through the German lines. If successful, it could change the course of the war. If it failed, the cost would be unimaginable. The strategy relied on one key belief. Before any soldier advanced, the Allies would unleash an enormous artillery bombardment. For days, thousands of guns would fire relentlessly at German positions. The goal was simple: destroy the trenches, cut the barbed wire, eliminate the enemy defenses. Nothing would be left, or at least that was the expectation. British commanders were confident. They believed the bombardment would crush the enemy. They believed the German lines would be shattered. They believed their soldiers would walk forward and take control with ease. Some officers even told their men there would be no need to rush. They could advance calmly, steadily. Victory seemed certain. And so, thousands of young men prepared themselves. They wrote letters home. They shared laughs with their friends. They checked their equipment one last time. Many carried heavy packs filled with supplies for the breakthrough they believed was coming. They had been told the enemy would be broken, that resistance would be minimal, that this would be the moment everything changed. But there was something they didn't know, something no one fully understood. The German defenses were far stronger than expected. Deep underground bunkers had protected soldiers from the artillery. Barbed wire still stood in many places, untouched. Machine guns remained, silent, waiting. As the bombardment finally came to an end, a strange silence fell over the battlefield. For days, the world had been nothing but noise. Now, there was only tension. On one side, thousands of British soldiers stood in their trenches, waiting for the signal. On the other, German troops climbed out from underground shelters, took their positions, and prepared their weapons. They knew exactly what was coming. In a matter of moments, the whistles would blow. Men would climb out of the trenches and step into no man's land. They believed they were walking to victory. They had no idea they were walking into one of the deadliest moments in human history. Because on July 1st, 1916, everything would go terribly wrong. And what happened next would shock the world. In just a few hours, tens of thousands would fall. July 1st, 1916. Dawn had barely broken, but the air already felt heavy. For 7 days straight, the world had been nothing but thunder. An endless storm of artillery fire had rained down on the German lines. Thousands upon thousands of shells, exploding without pause, tearing apart the earth, shaking the ground, filling the sky with smoke and dust. To the men waiting in the trenches, it sounded like the end of the world. And that was the plan. The belief was simple. No one could survive something like this. The enemy trenches would be destroyed. The barbed wire would be cut to pieces. The defenders would be dead or too shaken to fight. All that remained was to walk forward and take what was left. That morning, British soldiers stood in silence. Some adjusted their uniforms. Others gripped their rifles tightly. Many stared into the distance, toward no man's land. They had been told this would be the breakthrough. Some even believed it might be over by the end of the day. Then the bombardment stopped. After 7 days of constant noise, there was silence. A silence so sudden it felt unnatural. For a brief moment, the battlefield seemed frozen in time. And then the whistles blew, a sharp, piercing sound cutting through the morning air, the signal to advance. Men began climbing out of the trenches, one by one, then in lines, thousands of them. They moved forward steadily, just as they had been instructed, heavy packs on their backs, rifles in their hands, hope still alive in their minds. They stepped into no man's land, and for a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the machine guns opened fire. A sudden, violent eruption of sound. From the German lines, streams of bullets tore across the open ground, relentless, precise, unstoppable. The bombardment had failed. The German soldiers had survived, protected deep within reinforced bunkers. Their machine guns were intact, their positions were ready, and now They had clear targets. The British soldiers had been told to advance in formation, not to run, not to scatter, but to walk forward in lines. It made them easy to see, easy to aim at, easy to kill. Within seconds, the first wave began to fall. Men dropped where they stood. Some didn't even have time to react. Others tried to run, but the fire was too intense. Bullets cut through entire lines. Officers were among the first targets. Without leadership, confusion spread quickly. Still, the men kept advancing, because that was the order, because turning back felt impossible, because they believed they had to keep going. More soldiers climbed out of the trenches, wave after wave, each one walking into the same storm of bullets. The ground of no man's land quickly became a nightmare. Mud mixed with blood. Bodies lay scattered across the field. The wounded cried out, but there was no way to reach them. Some men tried to crawl forward. Others lay still, pretending to be dead. Many never moved again. In some areas, the barbed wire was still intact, thick, unbroken. Men became trapped in it, struggling to free themselves while exposed to gunfire. They were cut down where they stood. Entire units were wiped out within minutes. Friends who had trained together, who had laughed together, disappeared in an instant. The battlefield became chaos. And still, the attack continued. Hours passed. The sun rose higher in the sky, but the outcome never changed. Every attempt to advance was met with the same devastating fire, the same impossible resistance, the same loss. By midday, it was already clear. Something had gone terribly wrong. This was not a breakthrough. This was a massacre. Messengers tried to carry information back to command. Officers struggled to understand what was happening, but communication was slow, and the orders did not stop. More men were sent forward, into the same gunfire, into the same fate. By the end of the day, the numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. Nearly 60,000 British soldiers had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. Around 20,000 of them were dead in a single day. It was the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Entire towns back home would feel the loss. Families would receive letters, or sometimes nothing at all. Names would vanish from communities overnight. And for those who survived, the memory would never leave them. The sound of the machine guns, the sight of the fallen, the feeling of walking forward, knowing what awaited them. But even after everything that had happened, the battle was not over, not even close, because what took place on that first day was only the beginning. What followed would drag on for months, turning the fields of the Somme into something even worse, something far beyond a single day of horror, a war of exhaustion, of mud, of suffering without end. And the question remained, if this was the cost of just one day, how much more would be paid before it was over? The first day was over, but the battle was far from finished. What had begun on July 1st, 1916, did not end in a single moment of horror. It stretched on, day after day, week after week, month after month. The Battle of the Somme would continue until November, And in that time, it would become something even worse than a massacre. It would become a slow, grinding nightmare. The fields of the Somme were no longer fields. They had been transformed into a wasteland. Constant shelling had torn the land apart, leaving behind craters upon craters. Trees were reduced to splintered stumps. The ground was uneven, broken, and lifeless. And then the rain came. Heavy, relentless rain. It filled the shell holes with water. It turned the soil into thick, clinging mud. Mud that swallowed boots, mud that trapped equipment, mud that pulled men down and didn't let go. Soldiers struggled just to move. Every step became an effort. Every advance, a battle against the ground itself. Sometimes wounded men would fall into flooded craters and drown, unable to escape. Life in the trenches became unbearable. They were no longer just defensive positions, they were prisons. Narrow, overcrowded, and soaked with water, the trenches offered little protection from the misery around them. Rats thrived in this environment, large, fearless, feeding on scraps and on the dead. They crawled over sleeping soldiers, they nested among the bodies. There was no escape from them. Lice spread quickly, infesting uniforms and skin. Disease followed. Infections, fever, trench foot, a painful condition caused by constant exposure to cold and wet conditions. Feet would swell, rot, sometimes requiring amputation. And still, the soldiers remained. The smell was something many would never forget. A mixture of mud, decay, smoke, and death. Bodies often could not be recovered. They lay in no man's land, were buried just beneath the surface, disturbed again and again by artillery fire. Sometimes soldiers fought over ground where others had died just days before. The past never stayed buried. And yet the fighting did not stop. Again and again, orders were given to advance. Small attacks, limited objectives, a trench here, a few hundred meters there. Each gain came at a terrible cost. Thousands of men would go over the top for land that could barely be measured on a map, and often it would be lost again. The nature of the battle had changed. This was no longer about a single breakthrough. It had become a war of attrition, a test of endurance. Who could hold on longer? Who could replace their losses faster? Who could keep fighting despite everything? The answer came slowly and painfully. As the months dragged on, both sides began introducing new weapons in an attempt to gain an advantage. Flamethrowers appeared on the battlefield, sending bursts of fire into enemy trenches. Poison gas drifted across no man's land, forcing soldiers to rely on crude gas masks, never fully trusting the air they breathed. Artillery became even more relentless, more precise, more destructive. The sky itself seemed to rain death without warning. But nothing truly changed the nature of the fighting. Men still advanced into gunfire, still fell in the mud, still fought for ground that held little value except as a symbol of progress. Time lost meaning. Days blended into nights, nights into days. There was no rest, no safety, only survival. For the soldiers, the war became deeply personal. It was no longer about strategy or victory or even the enemy. It was about the man beside you, keeping him alive, trusting him to keep you alive, and somehow enduring another day. By the time autumn arrived, the battlefield had become almost unrecognizable. The mud was deeper, the destruction more complete, the cost unimaginable. Hundreds of thousands had already fallen, and still the battle continued. There were moments of progress, small victories that were reported as successes, but when seen from a distance, the lines had barely moved. All that suffering, all that loss for a few kilometers of devastated land. And yet, something new was coming, something that promised to change the battlefield, a weapon unlike anything seen before, slow, unreliable, but terrifying. It would soon appear on the Somme and signal the beginning of a new kind of warfare. Because as brutal as the past months had been, the war was still evolving, and the next phase would introduce a machine that could cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and bring a new kind of fear to the battlefield. A machine that would change war forever.
By late 1916, after months of bloodshed, mud, and stalemate, it had become painfully clear. Nothing was working. Every strategy, every offensive, every sacrifice had led to the same result. Minimal gains, massive losses. The war was stuck. And so both sides searched desperately for something new, something that could finally break the deadlock, something that could cross no man's land, survive machine gun fire, and carry the battle forward. And then it appeared. At first, it didn't look like a weapon. It didn't move like one either. Slow, heavy, almost unnatural. A strange metal machine crawling across the battlefield. To those who saw it for the first time, it looked like something out of another world. This was the tank. The British had developed it in secret, a new kind of war machine designed specifically for the nightmare of trench warfare. Its purpose was revolutionary: to cross rough terrain, to crush barbed wire, to protect soldiers from machine gun fire, and most importantly, to break through enemy lines where men alone had failed. And then, in September 1916, during the later stages of the Somme offensive, the tanks were deployed for the first time in history. It was a moment that would change warfare forever. Imagine the scene. German soldiers, hardened by months of relentless fighting, standing in their positions, used to the sound of artillery, used to the sight of advancing infantry. And then, through the smoke and chaos, they saw something new. A massive, armored vehicle slowly emerging from the fog, unaffected by bullets, crushing everything in its path. Barbed wire snapped beneath its weight. Trenches were no longer safe barriers. For the first time, the battlefield itself was being reshaped. The psychological impact was immediate. Some German troops panicked, others hesitated, because this was something they had never trained for, never imagined. A machine that could keep moving, even under fire. But the reality of the tank was far from perfect. These early machines were experimental, unreliable, difficult to control, and painfully slow. Many of them broke down before even reaching the battlefield. Engines overheated, tracks failed, mechanical parts simply gave up under the stress. Out of the tanks sent into action, Only a fraction actually made it to the fight. Those that did move forward did so at a walking pace, sometimes even slower. They were loud, clumsy, easy targets for artillery. And inside, conditions were brutal. The heat was intense, the air filled with fumes, the noise deafening. Crew members often struggled just to stay conscious. And yet, even with all these flaws, the tank represented something far more important than immediate success. It represented possibility. For the first time since the war had begun, there was a glimpse of change, a sign that the stalemate might not last forever, that technology, not just manpower, could shape the future of the battlefield. During the Somme, tanks were used in limited numbers. They did not achieve a decisive breakthrough. They did not end the battle. But they proved something critical. They showed that the old rules of war could be broken. No longer was the battlefield defined only by trenches and barbed wire. No longer were soldiers completely exposed when advancing. The tank had introduced a new idea: protection combined with movement, a way to fight and survive. Commanders took notice. Engineers went back to improve the design. Stronger engines, better armor, more reliable systems. The tank would evolve, and in time, it would become one of the most important weapons in modern warfare. But here, on the Somme, it was still just the beginning, an experiment in the middle of chaos. The battle itself continued, unchanged in its brutality. Men still fought in the mud, still advanced under fire, still paid the price day after day. Because even as new technology emerged, the reality remained the same. The Somme was not just a battle of machines. It was a battle of endurance, of suffering, of human cost on a scale the world had never seen before. And as the months dragged toward their end, one question remained. After everything that had been sacrificed, after all the lives lost, after all the ground gained and lost again, was any of it worth it? Because when the guns finally began to fall silent, the true cost of the Somme would be revealed, and it would leave a scar that history would never forget.
By November 1916, after months of relentless fighting, the guns began to fall silent. The Battle of the Somme was over. What had started with confidence, with hope of a breakthrough, with belief in a decisive victory, had turned into something else entirely, something far darker. The battlefield that remained was almost unrecognizable. What was once countryside had been reduced to a wasteland. Endless craters, shattered trees, mud as far as the eye could see. There were no clear signs of victory, no triumphant moment, only silence and the aftermath of destruction.
And then came the numbers, numbers so large they were difficult to comprehend. Over 1 million men, killed, wounded, or missing, from all sides, British, French, German, an entire generation scarred or lost.
when the guns fell silent at the Somme. The battle ended, but its impact did not. What remained was more than ruined land, more than numbers, more than history written in reports and maps. What remained was a scar carried by those who survived and by an entire continent that would never be the same again. The Battle of the Somme changed the way war was understood. Before it, many still believed in glory, in honor, in quick victories and heroic charges. After it, those illusions were shattered. The Somme proved that war had entered a new era, an industrial war, a war of machines, mass production, and relentless firepower, where strategy alone was not enough and human lives could be consumed on an unimaginable scale. Commanders began to rethink everything. Tactics evolved, technology advanced. The introduction of tanks, improved coordination between artillery and infantry, and new approaches to movement and communication all began to shape the future of warfare. The lessons were learned, but they had been paid for in blood. Beyond the battlefield, the impact was even deeper. Across Europe, families mourned. Cities and villages felt the absence of those who never returned. Entire communities had lost their young men. A generation had been broken. This became known as the lost generation. Not just those who died, but those who lived. Men who returned home, but were never truly the same, haunted by memories they couldn't escape, by sounds that never faded, by moments that replayed in silence. The trauma spread far beyond the soldiers. It reached into art, into literature, into the way people saw the world. Hope was replaced by disillusionment, the belief in progress shaken, the idea of war as something noble destroyed. And the Somme became a symbol, not of victory, not of triumph, but of the true cost of war. A place where hundreds of thousands had fallen for ground that barely mattered. A place where courage met reality, and reality won. Even today, more than a century later, the Somme is remembered, not just as a battle, but as a warning. A reminder of what happens when conflict spirals beyond control, when human lives become numbers, when the cost is no longer measured in territory, but in generations lost. And maybe that's why its story still matters, because it forces us to ask questions that have no easy answers. Was it worth it? Could it have been avoided? Have we truly learned from it? The echoes of the Somme still remain, in history, in memory, in silence. And now you've seen it unfold, from the hope before the battle, to the horror of the first day, to the months of suffering, to the cost that followed. If this story made you think, if it made you feel the weight of what happened, take a moment, because history like this should never be forgotten. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories that reveal the reality behind the headlines, the truth behind the wars, make sure to follow the channel, because there are many more moments in history that deserve to be remembered.